The sun was setting over the suburban neighborhood as Beth and David Parker sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by stacks of adoption paperwork. Their two boys, Tommy and Alex, were upstairs doing homework, but the house still felt like it was missing something. Beth had always known in her heart that their family wasn't complete yet. "Aren't you sure we're ready for this?" David asked, his reading glasses perched on the edge of his nose as he reviewed another document. Beth reached across the table and squeezed his hand. After 15 years of marriage, she could read the mix of excitement and nervousness in his voice. "Remember what we talked about last Christmas, when Tommy and Alex were helping at the community center?" Beth smiled, remembering how their sons had come home talking about the kids they'd met who didn't have families of their own. That day had planted a seed in all of their hearts. The couple had spent months researching adoption agencies, attending workshops, and preparing their home. Their boys, now 10 and 8, had been enthusiastically involved in every step, even offering to share their rooms and toys with their future sibling. It was a Tuesday morning when they first met her at Sunshine Adoption Center. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, led them down a hallway decorated with children's artwork. "She's a bit shy," Mrs. Chen explained, "but once she warms up to you, she's quite the little storyteller." The playroom door opened, and there she was. A small figure sat cross-legged on a colorful rug, carefully arranging wooden blocks into a tower. Her dark curly hair was tied back in two neat puffs, and her yellow dress had tiny butterflies printed on it. When she looked up, her deep brown eyes held a mixture of curiosity and caution. "Hi there," Beth said softly, kneeling down to the little girl's level. "I'm Beth. Would it be okay if we built something together?" The girl studied Beth for a moment, then wordlessly handed her a red block. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next hour, they built towers, knocked them down, and started again. David joined them on the floor, making silly sound effects each time the blocks tumbled, which eventually earned him a tiny giggle. Her name was Rose, they learned, and she was 5 years old. She loved butterflies, the color purple, and had a special stuffed elephant she carried everywhere. As they spent more time together, Rose began to show glimpses of her personality. She had a habit of scrunching her nose when she concentrated, and she'd clap her hands in delight when she successfully stacked blocks higher than herself. The Parkers visited Rose 3 times that week. Each time, she opened up a little more. By the third visit, she was showing them her favorite books and asking Beth to read to her. Tommy and Alex came along too, bringing their favorite childhood toys to share. Rose was particularly fascinated by Alex's old kaleidoscope, spending nearly an hour watching the patterns change. "She's had a difficult start," Mrs. Chen told them privately. "She came to us 6 months ago. The details of her background are limited, but she's shown remarkable resilience. She just needs a chance, and a family who will love her unconditionally." The decision wasn't hard. In fact, it felt like there was no decision to make at all. Rose already felt like part of their family. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork, home visits, and preparations. Tommy and Alex helped decorate the spare room, choosing lavender walls because they remembered Rose saying she liked purple. They hung butterfly decals on the walls and picked out soft, cozy bedding. The day Rose came home was sunny and clear. She clutched her stuffed elephant tightly as she walked through the front door, her eyes wide as she took in her new surroundings. The boys had made a welcome banner, slightly crooked but full of heart, with "Welcome Home, Rose," written in rainbow colors. "Would you like to see your room?" Beth asked gently. Rose nodded, slipping her small hand into Beth's. As they walked upstairs, David carrying her small suitcase, Rose's steps grew more confident. When she saw her room, her face lit up at the butterflies on the wall. She walked around slowly, touching everything with wonder: the soft blankets, the bookshelf filled with stories, the toy chest Tommy and Alex had filled with carefully chosen toys. That evening, as they sat down for their first family dinner together, Rose spoke more than she had all day. She asked if she could help set the table, carefully carrying each plastic cup to its place. During dinner, she even smiled at one of David's dad jokes, something about why the cookie went to the doctor, because it was feeling crumbly. Later, as Beth tucked Rose into bed for the first time, the little girl hugged her elephant close and whispered, "Can I stay here forever?" Beth's heart melted as she smoothed Rose's curls. "Yes, sweetheart, this is your home now. forever and ever. As Beth and David lay in bed that night, they couldn't stop smiling. Their family felt complete. They knew there would be challenges ahead. Adoption was a journey, not a destination, but they were ready to face whatever came their way. What they didn't know was that this was just the beginning of a story that would test their love, strength, and understanding of what family truly means. The first rays of morning sunlight crept through Rose's butterfly curtains, casting gentle shadows on her bedroom wall. It had been 3 weeks since she joined the Parker family, and each day brought new discoveries, both wonderful and challenging. That morning, like many others, started with the sound of tiny footsteps in the hallway. Beth was already awake, preparing breakfast, when she heard Rose's familiar shuffle. Unlike the first few days when Rose would wait quietly in her room, she now made her way downstairs on her own, clutching her trusted elephant friend. "Good morning, sunshine," Beth smiled, watching Rose's sleepy face appear around the kitchen doorway. "Would you like to help me make pancakes for everyone?" Rose nodded eagerly, already pushing her little step stool toward the counter. These morning routines had become their special time together. Beth would measure the ingredients, and Rose would carefully pour them into the bowl, her tongue sticking out slightly in concentration. "Can we make some for Elephant too?" Rose asked softly, holding up her stuffed companion. These were the moments that melted Beth's heart, when Rose felt secure enough to make simple requests, to show her playful side. "Of course we can. Elephant-sized pancakes coming right up." Upstairs, the sound of the boys getting ready for school filled the house. Tommy thundered down first, his backpack half-zipped. "Mom, have you seen my science project?" His voice was urgent, but he paused to give Rose a gentle fist bump, their special morning greeting. The kitchen soon became a whirlwind of activity. David appeared in his work clothes, helping Alex find his missing shoe while simultaneously trying to review a work presentation. Rose watched it all with wide eyes, still getting used to the morning chaos of a bigger family. But not every moment was filled with pancakes and fist bumps. Later that afternoon, when Beth picked Rose up from kindergarten, her teacher, Mrs. Wilson, pulled her aside. "Rose had a difficult day," she explained quietly. During story time, when another child tried to sit next to her, she became very upset. She spent most of the afternoon sitting alone. Beth's heart ached. They knew building trust would take time, especially with other children. That evening, while David helped the boys with homework, Beth sat with Rose in the cozy reading corner they'd created in the living room. "Would you like to tell me about what happened at school today?" Beth asked gently, not pushing but leaving space for Rose to share if she wanted to. Rose hugged Elephant tighter, her small fingers tracing the worn fabric of his ears, a habit they'd noticed she had when feeling nervous. "Lisa wanted to sit with me," she whispered finally. "But what if she doesn't like me tomorrow?" The fear in her voice was clear, the worry that connections could be temporary, that people could disappear. Beth and David had been warned about attachment challenges, but understanding them in theory was different from seeing Rose struggle with them. "You know what?" Beth said, pulling out a photo album they'd started. "Look at these pictures from last week, when you helped Tommy build that amazing Lego castle. And here's one from when you and Alex drew pictures for the fridge. They're still here, and they still want to build and draw with you. Sometimes people surprise us by staying." That weekend, they decided to take a small step forward in helping Rose feel more secure. David spent Saturday morning building a friendship fort in the backyard, really just some sheets draped over a clothesline, but to Rose it was magical. They invited 2 kids from her class, Lisa and Peter, for a supervised playdate. At first, Rose stayed close to Beth, watching from a safe distance as the other children explored the fort. But then Lisa brought out some bubble wands she'd brought, and the simple joy of chasing bubbles proved irresistible. By the afternoon, Rose was giggling as she ran through the yard, her initial fears temporarily forgotten in the simple pleasure of play. The real breakthrough came during dinner that night. As they sat around the table, sharing stories about their day, Rose spoke up without being prompted. "Can Lisa and Peter come back next week?" she asked, surprising everyone. "I want to show them my butterflies." Tommy and Alex exchanged excited looks with their parents. They'd been so patient, understanding that their new sister needed time and space. Now, seeing her want to share her special things with others felt like a tiny miracle. That night, as Beth and David got ready for bed, they talked about the day's events. Did you see how she shared her juice box with Lisa? David smiled. Last week, she wouldn't even sit at the same table with other kids at lunch. Small steps, Beth agreed, but her eyes were bright with happy tears. Remember what the adoption counselor said. Trust is built in moments, not days. They knew there would be more challenging days ahead. Rose still had nightmares sometimes, waking up crying for people whose names she couldn't or wouldn't share. She still struggled with changes in routine and showed signs of anxiety when either Beth or David had to leave for work. But there were also moments of pure joy, like when Rose taught Elephant how to dance to the radio, or when she fell asleep between Tommy and Alex during family movie night. She was beginning to leave small drawings on their pillows, stick figure families holding hands under crayon suns. Each night, Beth or David would check on all three children before going to bed. Rose's room was always last, and they'd often find her curled up with Elephant, her face peaceful in sleep. On this particular night, they noticed something new. She'd lined up all her stuffed animals along the edge of her bed, creating a protective circle around herself. But for the first time, Elephant was tucked under her arm rather than clutched tightly to her chest. It was a tiny change, but in the journey of building trust and creating family bonds, sometimes the smallest steps forward are the most meaningful ones. The autumn leaves were starting to fall when Beth first noticed something wasn't quite right with Rose. What began as occasional tiredness had slowly become more concerning. Their usually energetic 5-year-old, who loved chasing butterflies in the backyard with her brothers, now preferred to watch from the porch steps, Elephant clutched close to her chest. It started small, Rose falling asleep during her favorite cartoon shows, not finishing her afternoon snacks, asking to be carried up the stairs when she'd previously insisted on climbing them herself. At first, Beth and David chalked it up to the big changes in her life. After all, becoming part of a new family was bound to be exhausting. But then one morning, while helping Rose get dressed for school, Beth noticed dark circles under her daughter's eyes, despite her having slept for 10 hours straight. "I'm just sleepy, Mommy," Rose mumbled, rubbing her eyes. The word Mommy still felt new and precious, but today it came with a tinge of worry. During breakfast, Rose barely touched her favorite strawberry oatmeal. Tommy, ever the protective big brother, pushed his own bowl aside. "My tummy feels funny too," he announced, trying to make his sister feel less alone. But Beth could see the concern in his eyes. At 10 years old, he was old enough to sense when something wasn't right. Later that week, during Rose's regular checkup with Dr. Rivera, Beth voiced her concerns. The kind-faced pediatrician listened carefully, making notes as Beth listed the changes she'd observed. Rose sat quietly on the examination table, swinging her legs and holding Elephant, while Dr. Rivera checked her temperature, listened to her heart, and gently felt her neck and tummy. "Has Rose had any recent blood work done?" Dr. Rivera asked, reviewing the medical records they'd received from the adoption agency. Beth shook her head. The files were surprisingly thin, with many gaps in Rose's medical history. "I think we should run some tests," Dr. Rivera suggested gently, "just to make sure everything's working as it should. Would that be okay, Rose? We'll need to be brayed for a little while." Rose's grip on Elephant tightened. "Will it hurt?" she whispered. Dr. Rivera smiled warmly. "Just a tiny pinch, like a butterfly landing on your arm. And guess what? I have special Band-Aids with actual butterflies on them." That evening, Beth and David sat at the kitchen table after the kids were asleep, discussing the doctor's recommendations. "Dr. Rivera wants to do a complete health screening," Beth explained, her voice tight with worry. She said some of Rose's records from before the adoption seem incomplete. David reached across the table, taking her hand. "Whatever it is, we'll handle it together. Rose is our daughter now. Nothing will change that." The next few weeks became a blur of medical appointments. They tried to maintain normalcy at home, but the changes in routine were hard on Rose. Blood draws were especially challenging. Even the promise of butterfly Band-Aids couldn't completely ease her fears. Alex, their 8-year-old, proved to be surprisingly helpful during this time. He'd sit next to Rose in waiting rooms, teaching her to play thumb wars or showing her how to make shadow puppets on the wall. His constant chatter about school adventures and silly jokes often brought a smile to her face, even on the hardest days. One particularly difficult morning, after another blood draw, Rose was quieter than usual. Beth found her in the living room, arranging her stuffed animals in a circle. "What are you doing, sweetheart?" she asked, sitting down on the carpet beside her. "They're sick too," Rose explained softly, placing Elephant in the center. "I'm making them feel better." She reached for a toy stethoscope from her doctor kit, carefully checking each stuffed animal's heart. Beth's own heart squeezed. "Aren't you worried about being sick, honey?" Rose nodded slowly. "Will you have to take me back if I'm too sick?" The question hit Beth like a physical blow. "Oh, sweetheart, no." She pulled Rose into her lap, holding her close. "Never. You're our daughter, no matter what. Being sick doesn't change that at all." That night, Beth and David called a family meeting. They all sat in the living room, Rose curled up between Tommy and Alex on the couch, the boys unusually quiet. "The doctors are going to do some special tests to help Rose feel better," David explained. "And while they do that, we need to be Team Rose. That means we help each other and we stick together, no matter what." "Like Power Rangers?" Alex piped up, making Rose giggle despite her worry. "Exactly like Power Rangers," Beth smiled. "And you know what? Dr. Rivera suggested we start a special journal. Every day, we'll write down one good thing that happened, no matter how small." The idea caught on quickly. Tommy found an empty notebook with a purple cover, and they all took turns decorating it with stickers. Rose drew butterflies on every page, while Alex added superhero symbols in the corners. The first entry was simple. Today, Rose taught Elephant how to be a doctor. As the days passed, more tests were scheduled. Dr. Rivera mentioned words like genetic testing and comprehensive evaluation, but to Rose, the most important thing was that she got to wear her special Brave Girl cape, actually a pillowcase Tommy had safety pinned to her shoulders, to every appointment. Beth found herself studying Rose's face more often, memorizing every detail. The way her nose scrunched when she smiled, how her eyes lit up when she saw butterflies, the sound of her laugh when David made silly faces. Each night, after tucking the kids into bed, Beth would add her own private entries to a different journal, documenting every observation, every symptom, every question she wanted to ask the doctors. What they didn't know then was that these medical investigations would lead them down an unexpected path, one that would test their family's bonds in ways they never imagined. But for now, they'd focused on filling their purple journal with moments of joy. Today, Rose beat Tommy at Go Fish. Alex made Rose laugh so hard milk came out her nose. Rose's Brave Girl cape helped 3 other kids at the doctor's office feel brave too. Sometimes the smallest victories are the ones worth celebrating the most. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon. Beth was in the kitchen, helping Alex with his science project while Tommy practiced piano in the living room. Rose was napping upstairs. The medical tests had left her more tired than usual lately. "Mrs. Parker?" Dr. Rivera's voice sounded different somehow. "Could you and your husband come to my office tomorrow morning? We have Rose's test results, and there's something we need to discuss in person." Beth's hand tightened around the phone. She watched a drop of water fall from the kitchen faucet, counting the seconds it took to hit the sink, trying to keep her voice steady. Is it something serious?" "It's complicated," Dr. Rivera replied carefully. "But I think it's better if we talk about this face to face. Could you arrange for someone to watch the children?" That evening, after the kids were asleep, Beth and David sat on their back porch, speaking in whispers. Their neighbor, Mrs. Lee, had agreed to watch the children the next morning. "Whatever it is," David said, squeezing Beth's hand, "we'll face it together." The doctor's office felt different in the morning. The cheerful butterfly paintings on the walls seemed somehow muted. Dr. Rivera wasn't alone. There was another woman in the room, who introduced herself as Detective Chen from the Special Victims Unit. Beth felt her knees go weak. David guided her to a chair, his own face pale but composed. "First, I want you to know that Rose is physically healthy," Dr. Rivera began. "The fatigue we've been seeing is likely due to emotional stress, not any underlying medical condition. However, when we ran her genetic profile, we'd found something unexpected." Detective Chen opened a folder. "Rose's DNA matches that of a child who was reported missing 3 years ago from Pine Valley, about 200 miles from here. Her real name is Anna Chen, no relation to me. She was taken from her front yard while her mother was gardening." The room seemed to spin. Beth heard David's sharp intake of breath beside her. But that's impossible, she whispered. We adopted her through Sunshine Adoption Agency. We'd have all the paperwork. The paperwork was falsified, Detective Chen explained gently. We've been investigating a trafficking ring that's been operating under the guise of legitimate adoption agencies. They've been targeting vulnerable children, creating false documents, and placing them with unsuspecting families. Beth thought about Rose, no, Anna, sleeping peacefully in her butterfly room. She thought about the way the little girl had slowly begun to trust them, to feel safe. Her real family, she started, unable to finish the sentence. The Chens never stopped looking for their daughter, Detective Chen continued. They've kept her room exactly as it was, celebrated her birthday every year, never lost hope of finding her. David's voice was hoarse when he spoke. Does she remember them? Children who experience trauma often suppress memories as a coping mechanism, Dr. Rivera explained. The nightmares Rose has been having, her anxiety about abandonment, these could be manifestations of her buried memories. Beth thought about all the little things that suddenly made sense. How Rose had once mentioned loving dumplings, though they'd never made them at home. How she'd drawn a garden with red flowers again and again, saying they reminded her of before. What happens now? David asked, his arm around Beth's shoulders. Detective Chen's voice was kind but firm. We'll need to begin a gradual reunification process. The Chens have agreed to take things slowly, to minimize trauma to Anna. They understand she's bonded with your family. They sound like good people, Beth managed to say, though her heart was breaking. They are, Detective Chen nodded. They're elementary school teachers. They have an older daughter who's never stopped talking about her little sister. They've kept Anna alive in their hearts all this time. The next hour was a blur of discussions about next steps, child psychologists, and transition plans. Beth felt like she was underwater, hearing everything through a thick glass wall. She thought about Tommy and Alex, who loved their little sister so fiercely. About the butterfly room they'd painted together. About Elephant, who Rose couldn't sleep without. As they walked to their car, Beth stopped suddenly. David, she whispered, how do we tell her? How do we tell any of them? David pulled her close, right there in the parking lot. One step at a time, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Just like we've done everything else. One step at a time. They sat in their car for a long time, watching other families come and go from the medical center. A mother helping her elderly father with a walker. A couple carrying their newborn in a car seat. A father holding his daughter's hand as they skipped toward the entrance. Each one a reminder that family could take many forms, that love wasn't always simple or straightforward. Beth thought about the purple journal sitting on Rose's nightstand, filled with their daily moments of joy. Today's entry would be harder to write, but perhaps more important than ever. Because somewhere, in another house, another family had been keeping their own journal of sorts, marking the days until their lost daughter came home. The sun was setting by the time they pulled into their driveway. Through the living room window, they could see Mrs. Lee reading to all three children. Rose, Anna, was curled up in her usual spot, Elephant tucked under her arm, completely unaware that her world was about to change again. We'll make sure she knows she's loved, David said quietly. By all of us. Beth nodded, wiping her eyes. Tomorrow would bring challenges they couldn't yet imagine. But for now, they had this moment, watching their daughter safe and content, even if that safety was more complicated than they'd ever imagined. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and meetings with child welfare officials. Beth and David's living room, usually filled with the sound of children playing, now hosted serious discussions with detectives and social workers. They learned more about how their lives had accidentally intersected with a criminal operation that had hurt so many families. Detective Chen spread out photos and documents on their coffee table. Sunshine Adoption Agency was just one front for their operation, she explained. They had offices in 3 states, all looking completely legitimate. Even their employees didn't know what was really happening. Beth stared at the business card from the agency, remembering how warm and professional everyone had seemed. How did they fool so many people? They were very sophisticated, another detective added, clicking through files on his laptop. They had fake credentials, manufactured paperwork, even staged offices. They targeted smaller agencies that were struggling financially, bought them out, and used their good reputations as cover. While the adults talked downstairs, Rose played in her room with Tommy and Alex. Mrs. Lee had been staying with them more often, helping maintain a sense of normalcy for the children. Through the ceiling, they could hear occasional bursts of laughter. The kids were probably playing their favorite pretend game about running a pet shop. "What about the other families?" David asked, his voice tight. "Are there more children like Rose, like Anna?" Detective Chen nodded grimly. "We've identified 12 cases so far, some going back 5 years. Each child represents a family torn apart, and another family who thought they were giving a home to someone who needed it." Beth thought about all those families, all those lives turned upside down. She thought about the Chen family, who had spent 3 years searching for their little girl. "Have you told the other families yet?" "We're contacting them one by one," Detective Chen explained. "Each case is different. Some children were taken from other countries. Some were too young to remember their birth families. In every case, we're working with child psychologists to handle the transitions carefully." That evening, after the detectives left, Beth found herself in Rose's room. The little girl was asleep, curled up with Elephant. Beth gently touched one of the butterfly decorations hanging from the ceiling. They spun slowly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Mom?" Tommy's voice came from the doorway. He and Alex stood there in their pajamas, looking worried. "We heard you crying earlier." Beth gathered her sons close. They sat on the floor of Rose's room, speaking in whispers. "There's something we need to tell you," she began. "It's about Rose, and it's going to be hard to understand." The boys listened as Beth explained, in simple terms they could grasp, about Rose's real family, about how some bad people had taken her away from them, and how she had another mom and dad who had been missing her terribly. "But she's our sister," Alex protested, his voice wobbling. "She can't just leave." "She'll always be your sister," Beth assured him, pulling both boys closer. "Love doesn't follow simple rules. Sometimes it makes room for more people to care about each other." The next morning, they had a special visitor. Linda, a child psychologist, came to help them plan how to tell Rose about her birth family. She sat with Beth and David in the kitchen, drinking tea and discussing the best approach. "Children are remarkably resilient," Linda explained, "but they need to feel secure during big changes. The key is to help Rose understand that she's not losing a family, she's gaining one." They decided to start small. That afternoon, Linda sat with Rose, looking through a special picture book she had brought. It was about a butterfly who discovered she had 2 gardens to call home. The next few days passed in a blur of police interviews and meetings with child welfare officials. Beth and David's living room, usually filled with the sound of children playing, now hosted serious discussions with detectives and social workers. They learned more about how their lives had accidentally intersected with a criminal operation that had hurt so many families. Detective Chen spread out photos and documents on their coffee table. Sunshine Adoption Agency was just one front for their operation, she explained. They had offices in 3 states, all looking completely legitimate. Even their employees didn't know what was really happening. Beth stared at the business card from the agency, remembering how warm and professional everyone had seemed. How did they fool so many people? "They were very sophisticated," another detective added, clicking through files on his laptop. "They had fake credentials, manufactured paperwork, even staged offices. They targeted smaller agencies that were struggling financially, bought them out, and used their good reputations as cover." While the adults talked downstairs, Rose played in her room with Tommy and Alex. Mrs. Lee had been staying with them more often, helping maintain a sense of normalcy for the children. Through the ceiling, they could hear occasional bursts of laughter. The kids were probably playing their favorite pretend game about running a pet shop. "What about the other families?" David asked, his voice tight. "Are there more children like Rose, like Anna?" Detective Chen nodded grimly. "We've identified 12 cases so far, some going back 5 years. Each child represents a family torn apart, and another family who thought they were giving a home to someone who needed it." Beth thought about all those families, all those lives turned upside down. She thought about the Chen family, who had spent 3 years searching for their little girl. "Have you told the other families yet?" "We're contacting them one by one," Detective Chen explained. "Each case is different. Some children were taken from other countries. Some were too young to remember their birth families. In every case, we're working with child psychologists to handle the transitions carefully. That evening, after the detectives left, Beth found herself in Rose's room. The little girl was asleep, curled up with Elephant. Beth gently touched one of the butterfly decorations hanging from the ceiling. They spun slowly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "Mom?" Tommy's voice came from the doorway. He and Alex stood there in their pajamas, looking worried. "We heard you crying earlier." Beth gathered her sons close. They sat on the floor of Rose's room, speaking in whispers. "There's something we need to tell you," she began. "It's about Rose, and it's going to be hard to understand." The boys listened as Beth explained, in simple terms they could grasp, about Rose's real family, about how some bad people had taken her away from them, and how she had another mom and dad who had been missing her terribly. "But she's our sister," Alex protested, his voice wobbling. "She can't just leave." "She'll always be your sister," Beth assured him, pulling both boys closer. "Love doesn't follow simple rules. Sometimes it makes room for more people to care about each other." The next morning, they had a special visitor. Linda, a child psychologist, came to help them plan how to tell Rose about her birth family. She sat with Beth and David in the kitchen, drinking tea and discussing the best approach. "Children are remarkably resilient," Linda explained, "but they need to feel secure during big changes. The key is to help Rose understand that she's not losing a family, she's gaining one." They decided to start small. That afternoon, Linda sat with Rose, looking through a special picture book she had brought. It was about a butterfly who discovered she had two gardens to call home. "Sometimes," Linda explained gently, as Rose traced the butterfly's path with her finger, "we find out that we have more people who love us than we knew about." Over the next few days, they slowly introduced the idea of Rose's other family. They showed her pictures of the Chens, her birth parents, her older sister Emmy. They talked about the garden where she used to play, the red flowers she remembered. Rose was quiet at first, holding Elephant extra tight. But then she asked a question that broke and healed Beth's heart at the same time. "Can I keep both families?" "Yes, sweetheart," Beth answered, pulling her close. "You have so much love in your life, there's room for everyone." Meanwhile, the investigation continued. More families came forward, more stories emerged. The detectives worked tirelessly to unravel the complex web of deception. Beth and David provided statements, shared documents, helped in any way they could. One evening, Detective Chen showed them a photo that made them catch their breath. It was Rose, Anna, at age 2, sitting in a garden full of red peonies, laughing as her older sister Emmy pushed her on a tiny swing. The joy in that moment, captured 3 years ago, was pure and untouchable. "The Chens want to meet with you," Detective Chen said softly. "They want to thank you for taking such good care of their daughter. They say they've seen how much she's loved here." Beth looked at the photo again, at the little girl who had brought so much love into their lives, even through circumstances they never could have imagined. Tomorrow would bring more challenges, more adjustments, more moments of both heartache and hope. But for now, they could hear Rose upstairs, playing with her brothers, her laughter floating down like music. In the middle of this storm, she was still just a little girl who loved butterflies, who had enough room in her heart for two families, who had somehow brought healing to a wound she didn't even know existed. The day of the first meeting arrived with a mix of sunshine and clouds, matching the emotions swirling in everyone's hearts. Linda, the child psychologist, had helped arrange for the families to meet at a quiet playground, neutral ground where Rose could feel comfortable. Beth spent extra time that morning helping Rose pick out her clothes. The little girl chose her favorite purple dress with tiny butterflies, insisting on wearing her light-up sneakers that Tommy had taught her to tie. As Beth brushed Rose's curls, her hands trembled slightly. "Remember what we talked about?" Beth asked gently, securing Rose's hair with butterfly clips. "About meeting some special people today?" Rose nodded, clutching Elephant. "The other mommy and daddy from my old garden." Her voice was small but curious. They'd been looking at pictures of the Chen family all week, telling stories about the home where she used to live. The playground was empty when they arrived, just as planned. Tommy and Alex held Rose's hands as they walked toward the swings, her favorite spot. David carried a picnic basket filled with snacks that both families had helped plan. peanut butter sandwiches that Rose loved from the Parkers, and homemade dumplings that Mrs. Chen had prepared, remembering how her little Anna had always asked for more. When the Chen family arrived, time seemed to stand still. Mr. and Mrs. Chen stood at the entrance, holding hands tightly. Beside them was Emmy, now 11, clutching a worn teddy bear, the match to Rose's elephant, its partner from 3 years ago. Rose looked up from the swing, her eyes wide with recognition she couldn't quite understand. Something about Mrs. Chen's smile, about the way Mr. Chen's eyes crinkled at the corners, felt familiar in a way she couldn't explain. Linda stepped forward first, having met with both families separately. "Rose, remember the pictures we looked at? These are some people who have been waiting a very long time to see you." Annie moved first, walking slowly toward her little sister. She held out the teddy bear. "Hi," she said softly. "This is Bear. He's been missing Elephant a lot." Rose looked at the teddy bear, then at her own elephant. The two stuffed animals were clearly a matched set, though Bear showed signs of being well loved and often hugged. Something flickered in Rose's eyes, a shadow of memory, perhaps. "Want to swing?" Rose asked quietly, offering the first olive branch in her own way. The next hour unfolded like a delicate dance. The adults sat at a nearby picnic table, watching as the children slowly found their way to each other. Tommy and Alex included Amy in their games, showing her how they'd taught Rose to pump her legs on the swing. Amy shared stories about the garden at home, about the red peonies that were just starting to bloom again. Mrs. Chen had brought a photo album, and soon both families sat together, looking through memories of Anna's early years. Rose sat between Beth and Mrs. Chen, fascinated by pictures of herself as a baby, of the sister she was just getting to know again. "That's you on your second birthday," Mrs. Chen explained, her voice gentle. "You loved the little cake with strawberries on top." "I still love strawberries," Rose whispered, and Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears. The hardest moment came when it was time to leave. Rose clung to Beth's hand but kept looking back at the Chens, especially at Amy. The confusion in her eyes was heart-wrenching. She felt pulled between two worlds, two families, two sets of people who loved her deeply. That's when David had an idea. "What if," he suggested, "we all had dinner together next week? At our house." Rose could show Emmy her butterfly room. The relief on everyone's faces was palpable. It wasn't goodbye, it was just see you soon. That evening, as Beth tucked Rose into bed, the little girl had questions. "Is it okay to have two mummies and daddies?" she asked, her voice uncertain. Beth sat on the edge of the bed, choosing her words carefully. "Love is like your butterfly collection, sweetheart. Each one is different and special, and there's always room for more. Having two families just means you have more people to love you, and Tommy and Alex will still be my brothers." "Always," Beth promised. "And now you have a big sister too. Amy's been keeping your teddy bear safe all this time, just like you've been taking care of Elephant." Rose was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked the question that had been worrying her most, "Will I have to go away?" Beth's heart ached. "We're all going to figure this out together," she said honestly. "No one wants to take you away from people you love. We're going to find a way for you to have both families in your life." Later that night, Beth and David sat with the Chens in a quiet cafe, while Linda helped guide them through difficult discussions about the future. They talked about shared custody, about maintaining Rose's stability while helping her reconnect with her birth family, about school arrangements, holiday plans, ways to make this unprecedented situation work. "She calls you Mummy," Mrs. Chen said softly to Beth. "I heard her today. You've given her so much love." "She's easy to love," Beth replied, reaching for Mrs. Chen's hand across the table. "And she deserves all the love both our families can give her." The two mothers shared a look of understanding, both knowing the pain and joy of loving this little girl, both willing to put her needs above their own heart's desires. As they left the cafe, plans taking shape for the future, Mr. Chen stopped to show them something on his phone, a photo he'd taken at the playground. In it, Rose sat on the swing, Amy pushing her, while Tommy and Alex made funny faces in the background. All four children were laughing, unaware of being photographed. It wasn't the family picture anyone had imagined, but maybe it was something even more beautiful, a picture of love finding a way to grow beyond boundaries, beyond expectations, beyond loss into something new and healing. 1 year later, the butterfly garden bloomed with more colors than ever before. Rose stood in the middle of it, now 6 years old, watching a monarch butterfly land on one of the purple coneflowers she and Amy had planted together. The garden was special, a bridge between her two homes, created with love from both families. The past year had brought changes that no one could have predicted. After months of careful transitions and countless family meetings, they had found a rhythm that worked for everyone. Rose spent weekdays with the Parkers, weekends with the Chens, and holidays were celebrated together. It wasn't always easy, but love made it possible. "Look what I found." Annie called out, rushing into the garden. At 12, she had become the kind of big sister who could bridge both worlds effortlessly. She held up a small container with air holes punched in the lid. Inside, a caterpillar inched along a milkweed leaf. Rose's eyes lit up. "Can we watch it turn into a butterfly?" "That's the plan," Annie grinned. "We can keep it at Mom and Dad's house this week, and then bring it to Beth and David's next week. It should be ready to emerge by then." Inside the Chen house, preparations were underway for a special celebration. It was the anniversary of the day the families had first met at the playground. Now, instead of uncertainty and fear, the house buzzed with the warmth of connection and shared joy. Tommy and Alex burst through the back door, carrying bags of craft supplies. "Mom said we could make butterfly decorations," Tommy announced. At 11, he had grown into his role as protective older brother to not just Rose, but Amy too. Mrs. Chen stood at the kitchen counter, teaching Beth how to fold dumplings while they chatted about Rose's upcoming school play. The two mothers had developed their own special friendship, built on their shared love for the little girl who had brought their families together. "Remember how worried we all were?" Beth said softly, attempting to seal a dumpling. "About how this would work." Mrs. Chen nodded, gently showing Beth how to pinch the edges properly. "And now look at us. Two families, twice the love." In the living room, David and Mr. Chen were setting up a slideshow of photos from the past year. There were pictures of Rose's first day back at her old preschool, where she'd reconnected with old friends. Photos of both families at the beach, at birthday parties, at simple Sunday dinners. Each image told the story of healing and growth. "Got it," Alex called out, holding up a string of paper butterflies he'd made. At 9, he had become an expert at crafts, always trying to make things that would make his sister smile. The doorbell rang. Detective Chen had arrived with good news. The investigation had led to the shutdown of 3 more fake adoption agencies, preventing other families from experiencing the same trauma. More importantly, she had helped establish new guidelines for adoption agencies, creating better safeguards to protect children and families. "You know," Detective Chen said, watching the children play in the garden, "your story has helped other families in similar situations. You've shown that there's hope, that healing is possible." The afternoon turned into evening, and both families gathered around a long table in the backyard. Paper butterflies danced in the breeze above them, and string lights twinkled like stars. Rose sat between her two mothers, Elephant and Bear, propped up together in a chair nearby. "Can I tell the story?" Rose asked as they finished dinner. It had become a tradition. She loved telling her own version of how her family grew bigger instead of breaking apart. Everyone nodded, settling in to listen. Rose stood up, her confidence growing with each word. "Once upon a time," she began, "there was a little girl who had 2 gardens to call home. In one garden, there were butterflies and 2 brothers who taught her how to climb trees. In the other garden, there were red flowers and a big sister who kept her teddy bear safe for years and years." She looked around at all the faces she loved, Beth and David, who had opened their hearts to her, Mrs. and Mr. Chen, who had never stopped searching, Tommy and Alex, who had shown her what brotherhood meant, and Amy, who had waited so long to be a big sister again. "Some people think you can only have one family," Rose continued, reciting the words that had become her truth. "But I have 2, and that makes me twice as lucky." The investigation had led to changes in adoption policies across the country. New safeguards were put in place, background checks became more thorough, and agencies were monitored more closely. But perhaps the most important change was in how people understood family, that it could expand and grow in unexpected ways. As the evening wound down, Rose ran back to the butterfly garden one last time. The monarch butterfly was still there, its wings catching the last rays of sunlight. Tommy and Amy followed her, then Alex, then all the adults, until the entire family stood together in the garden. "Make a wish," Beth whispered as the butterfly took flight. Rose closed her eyes but then opened them quickly. "I don't need to," she said, reaching for both her mother's hands. "I already have everything I could wish for." Later that night, as the stars came out, two families who had become one watched their children chase fireflies in the garden. They had turned a story that could have been about loss into one about finding more love than they ever imagined possible. And somewhere in the garden, among the flowers and butterflies, a caterpillar began its own journey of transformation, proving that sometimes the most beautiful changes come from the most unexpected beginnings.